Hi, this is Steve Bunacontri from SOA Consulting Services, continuing our Angular 4 tutorial on observables. Today we're going to talk about some code examples involving observables, some with simple events, some calling web services. And this is the second part of our observable tutorial. Okay, so basically what I did was, first I created a project using Angular CLI in WebStorm called Observables. The name of the project is Observables. It generated an index.html for me, a main driver, and it created a seed project for me which I overwrote with my own code. So let's take a look at the index.html. There's an app root tag, which is my Angular 4 application. And then I have a main.ts driver file, which bootstraps my app module. It also checks the environment and if production, it enables production environment. It enables production mode. Okay, so let's look for the app module. Here's the app module. There's an app components, there's a template, there's a style sheet. So it looks like a simple application. So let's take a look at the app module, which is being bootstrapped by my main.ts file. Okay, so let's see what's involved here. We got the platform browser dynamic, which we don't need. We have an ng module for the annotation, a browser module, which we import, and we have a reactive forms module, which we use. And we have a custom app component. The custom app component is listed in the declarations, and it's also bootstrapped. This is the root app component. We use the reactive forms module because that's where the observables are, and we're going to be writing a little program which uses some of the objects in this module. Okay, so it's just pointing to one of our custom app components. Let's take a look at that. Okay, it imports a component. It imports a form control, which is what we use for, let's say, an input field. We have a selector here, which is app root. Oh, we also include what we need from the observable package, which is a debounce time function. And I could either import all the operators in the RxJS package, or I could import whatever I need in this particular file. Okay, so right now we also have a template, which is an app.component.html file, and we have a style sheet. And here is the definition of our app component class. Notice it's exported because there's another file here, module, which is using it. We have a search input, which we define to be, which is of type form control, and we instantiate form control with an empty string. We have a constructor here which says for this form control element, when values change, do a debounce time on the stream and then subscribe to the stream. Once the observable starts streaming take the data and use the fat arrow operator and get the product price on the data. So to get the product price, what we do is we just log the price into the console using some random number generator. But I'll go back to this. I'll come back to this and explain a little bit more. Let's take a look at the template. The template has a div tag and an h2 tag. It says observable events and has an input field of type text. There's a placeholder that says enter product name. And then we point to the form control, which is this template item gets mapped to. Now remember, in reactive forms, you build the object, which in this case here, which is using a simple form control, and then you map the attributes of the template using directives to that form. So although our form is a simple control, we're using a directive to map the form control to our search input attribute in our component. Okay, and just so you know, the div tags, the h2 tags, I might color them differently. I have some styles here which I might use. Let's start up our project. What I just did is I use npm to do a start. npm start is mapped to CLI, the ng command, serve. Serve is the Webpack development server, which fires up and serves our application, but also looks for changes in the code. As we change the code, it updates the front end. So while we're doing that, let's find our Google browser and fire up that. Let's go back to our code. Okay, so once again, we got the main driver, Bootstrap's app module. We got the app module, which is bootstrapping our root app component. We got our app component, which provides the app root tag or selector corresponding to our index.html. We have an attribute in our app component called search input. It's a form control. Its value changes are streamed to us as the user's typing into the input field. The values will be streamed. I'm gonna debounce time for a half a second of subscribed, which means, okay, the user could be typing 1 character, 2 character, and a half a second give me the stream. So what happens here is every half a second, I'm given a stream of data from the input field. As more characters come in, the next half a second I get more characters, and I'm invoking the get price function. Okay, let's see what happened here. So I go to localhost, port 4200, and I'm going to open up the console to see what happens. Okay, now I'm going to enter product name here. Okay, let's see what happened. The price of the car is $40. So notice what just happened there. I typed in TEN. A half a second went by. It streamed the TEN and calculated the price. As my value was changing of my form control, it waited a half a second and gave me 3 characters. And then it invoked the get product price. So you could play around with increasing the debounce time, but I don't recommend it. I do recommend it. Just play around with it and see what happens. But it's very hard to interpret what's going on because of the Webpack repackaging and seeing your changes and deploying the code. It's hard to understand the timing of when it happens. Okay, so let's do a little experiment. 1, 2, 3, 4. We caught the third and it caught the fourth. So usually the way you use something like this is, let's suppose the user's typing in. The user's typing in, and here this is nothing. But let's suppose the user's typing in. Let's just try it once. If it doesn't work, we'll change it. But let's suppose I turn this into 2 seconds. Let's see what happened here. It recompiled. Let's see if I could type in antique. Looks like it didn't really take effect. That's why I'm saying I might have to restart this thing. And now I'm worried about cache here. Okay, that worked. So it waited 2 seconds before it grabbed my characters. So the bottom line is most of the time as you're typing, like you're looking for stock quotes or something like that, behind the scenes you're making a web service call. And there's something I didn't point out, but the observable could grab your characters and you could make the web service call and be waiting on an observable from the web service call, and then as the user is still typing, you're getting a more accurate description of what the user is asking for. So you could go and call the web service again. So if you're waiting for an observable and you call the web service again, the observable is killed, and you're streaming. You go call the web service, and you're getting a different stream of the observable. So the observables have some also have some characteristics of stopping what it was previous doing because you're asking for something new, and I just want to leave it at that. You could take a look at that later. Okay, so let's look at a different example. Let me close this up. Okay, notice it was events that we were looking at, and a stream, an observable used in the built-in form capability of the reactive forms package. We were using the reactive forms module. You do not get this behavior when you're using template-driven forms. Okay, let's go to the next package. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to move to observe start HTTP. Let me start up this thing. And let's start taking a look at this code. I created a project called Observable HTTP. My Angular CLI JSON file describes everything associated with my project, where my test programs are, where my root source is, where my resources are being placed in the dist directory, etc., what my index.html file is, and what my main driver is, etc. It's also pointing to the polyfills which are being used to fill in what's needed for ES6 and TypeScript or whatever. Okay, so let's look once again. We've got an app root tag. We have a file here which is not formatted, so I'm going to format it. Once again, we're bootstrapping an app module. Where's our app module? Here. We go look at our app module. Okay, so we have a browser module, ng module, and HTTP module. This is extremely important when calling web services. There's an HTTP object in the HTTP module, and when we call that HTTP object, we could do get, we could do a post, we could do different web service function calls on this built-in object that comes with the HTTP module, so it's really important. I don't even know if we're using this anymore, but we have a My Places service, we have an app component, and we have a My Places component. Now, we import in the module, we have to import everything we're using. We're using the HTTP object, so we need the HTTP module. We're using reactive forms, we won't need this module. And we're using the browser module. And we declare all our custom components here. And I'm listing My Places as a provider because I want to be able to inject this service into one of my components, in particular this one. Once I list it as a provider, I can inject it into My Places component. The alternative is listing it as a provider for that component only, but then this here lets the whole app module use that provider. Okay, and I bootstrap the app component. So app component is here. It's under components, application. So let's take a look at that application component. Okay, so I import several things I might use from the RxJS package. I'm going to use a map. And I put this catch here because I really should probably do a catch, but I'm not doing it right now. I have a component from the Angular core, and I have a form builder, a form control, a form group, and validators from Angular forms. Okay, I'll describe what these things are. Validators validate forms. Form group groups form elements. Form controls, in some sense, could be an element, a form element. And form builder is a very convenient way to group controls and associated validators. Okay, so the selector is app root. There's a template. There's a style sheet. The app component has a form model called a form group, and it has a limit called a string. The constructor, in reactive forms, you define a form model, you define your attributes of your form, and then you create a template that maps to it. So we have a form model here, and we're going to be pointing to it from the template. We have a limit string, which is the value that I'm going to use to limit the results of our web service on the front end. The constructor injects a form builder into my constructor. Notice how this is just magic. I just have to include it, and I could use it for injection. This is really nice. Okay, this .form model, the form model, which is of type form group, is equal to a form builder .group. So I'm asking form builder to give me the form group, because with the form builder I could say, here's an attribute, here's a validator, and a data type of that attribute, and I could start listing these things, and it's very easy. It's a simplified way to list all your attributes of your forms and your associated validators. So here I have a limit, which is a form control. It's an input field. It's a simple input field, and I'm just demonstrating the form builder with it. Okay, and what else do I have in my class? I have an onSubmit function, which, when submitted from the template, it gets the value of the form model, which could be a JSON object. And then I look at the limit attribute of that object, and I log it to the console. And then I have an ng on init, because I want to find that, because the life cycle of this object's important for me to understand and also be able to do certain things. For example, I could call a web service in the constructor. On the init, I could subscribe to the result. So I keep this function here because it's good practice to make sure you're doing things in the right place within your components. And the constructor constructs it. The ng on init does more initialization, and we'll be using it in the next component. Okay, so let's look. First of all, let me show you what we're looking at here. The user interface, basically what it does is, by default, it looks at the number of subway stations in New York City, and it looks at 10 of them. So basically, we've got a parent application component, we have a child application component, and what the parent does is it initially it has the child component, and the child component is really self-contained. It's a reusable component. So basically, the child component says, what is my initial number of rows I should render? It's 10. So the child component's calling a service which calls an HTTP service object from Angular 4 and yields the results. And then what I do is I list the web service results. I list a row number, and if you change the number of rows when I submit, the new limit gets passed into the child component by wiring of the components. So let's go back and take a look, because we're supposed to be talking about observables here. So let's get to the observable aspect of this application. Okay, so the template has a form model, and And this directive maps the form group of this particular form in the template to the form model in my app component. And when there's an event, an ng-submit event, it invokes the onSubmit function in my component. And I try to skip HTML validation because I'm doing validation in the component. So here's my onSubmit function. Okay, I show the limit, and then I have an input field, type text, and I say the form control name of this input field is limit. Limit is my attribute in my app component. And the way I map the input field to that limit is using a form control name attribute. And I also have a little bit of code here to say, well, when the form model, has an error with this attribute and its validator minimum length, show the error. So let's not get too hung up on that. And there's a button here, a submit button, which invokes the which sends the ng-submit event. And then look what I have here, a child component. And what I do is I pass in a parameter to the child component. This syntax, this directive, allows me to pass a parameter into the child. And we call this component wiring. And we also can refer to this as intercomponent communication. But let's not get hung up on that either. Okay, let's go look at the child component. I'm curious about the My Places here. So I go to look at My Places component, and sure enough, there's a selector here, a My Places selector. So we're looking at the right component. Okay, this does a number of things. First of all, it uses an observable, which is what we're trying to talk about here. And there's other different things about the component. We're inputting input, non-changes, and simple change. I'm also doing some other fancy stuff in here. Wiring a parameter passed into the component using an input annotation, and it's getting mapped to a row number. And My Places component is implementing an onChanges interface. Now, the other stuff that I'm doing here, I'm using some functions of the RxJS. I'm using service URLs to point to some URLs of some web service that I'm calling. And then I'm going to implement my Places component. So let's take a quick look at that. So the first thing I want to show you is I do have a config file here which points to a URL of a web service I'm going to call. And there's a Google token, and there's an initial limit of the number of rows I'm going to return from the web service to the front end. And although I have this Google API, which is this URL, which I can use to make a web service call, I broke it down into a URL, base URL, a token, and a limit, because I'm going to reconstruct the URL when I change the limit. Once again, not that important, but I just want to show you that. Okay, so let's take a look at what this function, what this component does. Okay, so the high level view of it is we have subway stations. We use a generic array to store them. We have a data source, which is an observable of any type. We have an app limit string. We have a final limit string. I'm trying to denote the initial limit that comes out of the config file versus what the user is typing. So I might need those attributes. Now, at a high level, I have a constructor, have an ng on init, and have an ng on changes. And so the life cycle of the component is going to be, it's going to get constructed, and then it's going to get initialized. And then when the parent passes me new limit values, maybe the ng on changes is going to get invoked. So, but it's an important example here using observables. First of all, the constructor, what the constructor does is it gets the service URL. It gets the initial limit value, and it stores it for later use. Because I'm constructing the object, I could put that in the ng on init. That's probably where it should go. But what I also do is I invoke a my places service, and I get subway stations. That goes into the data source. The data source is an observable. Now, the service, my places service, did call HTTP object in Angular 4, did get back an observable, but the web service is not called yet. And then I log some stuff. And when I say the web service is not called yet, because the ng on init gets invoked next. And that subscribes to the data source. And this is where the stream starts coming, okay? Now, I don't do it to bounce time here because the user's not typing characters. I want the result in the data. So basically, I'm getting the complete stream here, which is then processed using this fat arrow operator. I basically, if the array is, if the data is an array that's getting passed to me, I just put it in the subway stations. So now my subway stations attribute has my result set from my web service. Notice, once that is populated, if you look at the template, it's going to start rendering right away. Okay, why? Because my template is basically using the subway stations object to render the rows. Okay, so let's take a look at the template really quick. The number of subway stations in the table is final limit. Like I said, not important. It's the initial value out of the config file, and if the parent gives me a new value, it's that value. Okay? What I do is I have a table here, and I have a caption, City of New York subway stations. I have a table header. I have a row number, a line, a location. And what I do is I iterate through using directives through the subway stations array. And for each subway in that array, I show you the subway line and the subway name. And then I create a link. Notice also I'm getting, each time this iterates, there's a new scope in Angular 4 that's created per iteration. And I define a variable I as the index of my iterations. So I could label the row number that's being rendered here. Let's go back and see it again. So the MyPlaces component looked at the initial value. The constructor used an observable to get the subway stations, and then the ng on init subscribed to that, populating the subway stations array, and then the table got rendered. I rendered the row number here with the I, which was equal to index for each iteration, and then I listed the line and the location, and a link to locate. Okay, so let's just look at the code a little bit more, and then we'll take a look at some logging. So now, what else does this thing do? Okay, now notice I have an input row number here, and I'm implementing on changes. Here's the ng on changes. What I'm doing is saying every time a parent updates my row number, invoke this ng on changes. It's just verifying what my change is. Begin ng on changes of my places component. I look at the JSON object of the changes, and then what I do is I have to call the MyPlaces service again, because I need more subway stations. But this time I subscribe to it right away, and the data gets mapped to subway stations. So the behavior that you get is this. Okay, so we've been using this MyPlaces service. Let's go take a look at that. But we could also, if you wanted to, take a look at the log. Okay, there's a lot of junk getting logged here, but let's just see what happened. I typed in a limit of 25. ng on changes of the MyPlace component got invoked. Notice I changed this to MyPlaces component, but it didn't take effect. And it shows the previous value was 23. The current value is 25. The first, whatever this is. But I'm just logging this just to show you when your ng on changes function is occurring. Okay, and just one more thing. Let's look at the services object. Notice that MyPlaces service was listed as a provider in the app module. That's how come we could inject. If you're building a custom service, you got to list it as a provider so it can get injected into components. Okay, so what does my service do? It uses observables as well, but it also uses this HTTP function. And I declare my MyPlaces service as an injectable. I export it so the other files can see it. I have some data here. I have a data source here, which is an observable, And this particular constructor looks at the initial URL, dynamically constructs a URL, and then when the service is called, when the get subway station is called, we call it two different ways. One with no arguments and one with an argument. So the limit is an optional parameter of this particular function. It does return an observable, and if there is a limit, I set the dynamic URL with the limit. Else, I reset it back to the original limit, which was 10. And this data source, I do an HTTP GET on the dynamic URL, and I map it to JSON results. And I return the data source. So my custom, the component is getting an observable returned to them. And once they get that observable, they subscribe. And at that point, the web service is actually, this method is actually executed. So let's go back and look at the get subway stations and the My Places component. Let's see where and how we call it. Here we're calling it with no arguments. Here we're calling it with an argument. Now, the funny thing is, I overloaded this function in Angular 2 and it worked. In Angular 4 it did not. So obviously the code getting generated supposedly didn't work. I was getting errors. So I had changed my service function. I had overloaded the get subway stations with no arguments and with one argument, and it worked in Angular 2. But I had to single that down to one function because obviously the transpiler was giving me a problem with overloaded functions. So I just put in this optional limit function, this optional parameter syntax. Okay, well, once again, I guess one more comment. I have an app component here and I have a child component. I have these components wired together. There's inter-component communication going on here, and I used observables in different ways, but I could have made this example a lot simpler. The My Places component could have also just used the HTTP. Instead of injecting the My Places service into the constructor, I could have used HTTP and just did a get on the URL inside the component. So there's a difference between, I have this component using HTTP, it's reusable component, but here what I did was I created a reusable service, a reusable component that used that service, and the bottom line is in this particular implementation, this service I could have called Google service, and I could have called it from any component I wanted to, and I could have made this a lot more reusable. Okay, well that's it, and thank you for your time, and stay tuned for the next tutorial.